There's no need for indignation to the Chair. The Chair is well aware of what's occurring in the House, and I will take the call from the Honourable Pete Hodgson.
I think it's time to return to to clause 88. Can't even remember what the clause is. Part 3 anyway, part 4, clause 88, bottom of page 60, and get a few things said. My colleague Marion Street mentioned that ministerial accommodation is now provided at the rate of $37,500 per minister. And that's the case. There are 2 exceptions, however. One is where the minister lives in Wellington, as does the Minister of Revenue, the Honourable Peter Dunn. The Honourable Peter Dunn is eligible for no such...
And he's never sought anything. Never sought anything.
And has never sought any. Indeed he has not, I'm sure, because he goes home when he goes home, which is not something that I was able to do or am able to do, because I don't live in Wellington, I live in Dunedin. So any minister who lives in Wellington is not eligible for that $37,500, and therefore any possibility that the provision of the accommodation allowance instead of accommodation in line 2930 of page 60 cannot apply to a Wellington-based minister. But there's another category of minister who also does not receive $37,500, and that minister is one who used to have a house when they were in opposition, and they live during the week in that same house now that they are a minister in government. And their allowance is not $37,500. I can't remember what it is. It's a little bit less than that. Let's call it $27,500. I have actually forgotten. The point of this is that the $37,500 is payable to those ministers, and most ministers fall into the $37,500 category. It's payable to them irrespective of how much money they spend on accommodation. It's a gift. It goes into their bank account fortnightly or monthly or whenever it is for them to spend on accommodation as they see fit. They are, of course, entitled to spend more than $37,500 a year on Wellington accommodation. And maybe some of them do. But if one thinks around $37,500 as being a reasonably large amount of money compared with the amount of money that backbenchers get to spend on Wellington accommodation, somewhere less than 2/3 of that, then one can come to the conclusion that some ministers are able to live in Wellington rather cheaply indeed. In fact, once you've got an incentive on anyone to say, look, you don't need to provide receipts for this expenditure, just take the money and use it as you see fit, of course the logic is, let's go and stay with cousin. Let's go and stay with cousin. Now, I don't know whether any minister does that. I don't know whether any minister does that, but the point I'm making, and the Honourable Tariana Turia thinks it's funny. I don't. I think if we're looking for greater transparency in our systems, including the treatment of taxation for these things, as in clause 88, then giving people $37,500 and saying you can have it no matter how much you spend is not transparent. It is not transparent. And so what happened was that this House got into a bit of a lather about a year ago concerning the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, who was double dipping in Dipton and in Wellington. And as a result of that, the Prime Minister, John Key, says, don't worry, I'll fix it. We'll have a new system. That system was too complicated. Well, it wasn't complicated for every other member of the National Māori Act government cabinet. It certainly wasn't complicated when I was in cabinet, but it seems to be too complicated now, as in poor old Bill English got it all confused. So we changed the system. And the system change, the Prime Minister told us, would be cheaper. He said, Just you wait. I'm going to be really tough on my ministers. They're only going to get $37,500. Yeah. So guess what?
It was a 50% increase.
Well, you know, what's happened is that the price of ministerial... Mr Chairman, the price of ministerial expenditure has gone up. The price of ministerial expenditure has gone up. So to recap, we have no taxation, as mentioned in clause 88, page 60, on ministerial expenditure, and I think that's proper. We've moved from actual and reasonable expenses, the actual costs, to some guesswork costs for every minister. The guesswork has come in at $37,500. Of course, every minister, reasonably, has maxed that out. They're all saying, yep, sure, I'm going to take all of that. In fact, it's given to them. They've got really no option. And then we tot it all up and we find that the Prime Minister, who promised New Zealand cheaper ministerial accommodation, has given New Zealand more expensive ministerial accommodation. And although I don't sort of aim this at ministers, that means that a bunch of taxpayer money that used not to go into ministerial pockets now does go into ministerial pockets at a time when we're all supposed to be having a nil wage increase. So you can see that there's an issue around ministerial accommodation which is not fixed by clause 88, page 60 of this legislation. It is not fixed. And the only way to fix it is to go back to actual and reasonable expenses by one method or another. And I think that an honest and transparent government, or an honest and transparent bunch of ministerial services, or an honest and transparent minister of ministerial services, would take us back to that form of payment, which has served New Zealand rather well for a rather long time, including any minister on this side of the House, and of course for the first couple of years all the ministers on that side of the House as well. So I think clause 88 is worth reflecting on for what it doesn't do. I'm pretty sure it will not cover that $37,500 expenditure. I'm pretty sure it will not make it taxable. I don't think it should be taxable, but I do think that the way in which we have managed to give ourselves an increase in ministerial expenses does need to be addressed.
I thought the Minister might be taking a